make a contribution. For attendees, we invite your active participation throughout the session and via the Q&A box on your screen. If you have any questions at any point, please kindly type it in the Q&A box, and our team will do their very best to hold it for the appropriate Q&A session towards the end of this program. Today's session, like I had mentioned in my opening, is power-packed, and we're delving into various dimensions of the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Standards. The agenda before me would have opening remarks from the Executive Secretary, CEO of the Federal Reporting Council of Nigeria, Ambassador Shehu Adam Mohammed, and his remarks will be followed by remarks from Ms. Tinuade Awe, Chief Executive Officer, NGX Regulation Limited, and thereafter we'll have Dr. Indidi Noli Edozie. She's an ISSB board member who would also proceed to giving us more insights on the first presentation, IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Standards, S1, S2 proportionality, and FRIS. And this presentation would also be supported from more insights from Dana Nora Aria De Marco. She's an SSB technical fellow. And then we'll take question and answer after this presentation, before we move straight into the industry-based disclosures, introduction and use of SASB standards. And this will be facilitated by Arturo Rodriguez, is the manager of Ibero-American Relations IFRS Foundation. We'll take more question and answers for this session, and then we'll take virtual group photos and bring the session to a close. I'm very certain that we're more than ready to receive more insights on today's topic. First off, I would now call on the Executive Secretary, CEO, Federal Reporting Council of Nigeria, Ambassador Adamu Mohammed Shuaibu, for his welcome remarks. Over to you, sir. If you're speaking, you're on mute, sir.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning to all the participants, those here present physically and those who have joined us virtually, both from Nigeria and from sister African countries, as well as the ISSB officials who have also joined. I want to use the opportunity to welcome all of us to this first series of 4 capacity building programs jointly organized by the Financial Reporting Council of Nigeria, the Nigerian Exchange Group, as well as the International Sustainability Standards Board. As we are aware, the International Sustainability Standards Board came into being at COP26. Since that time, they've been working very hard to develop sustainability standards to be used across the world. So far, they've been able to develop 2 standards, which we are hoping will be launched on 26th of June. That's a few weeks from now. And I'm happy to say that Nigeria is one of the countries selected. In fact, I think the only African country that has been selected for the launching of these standards. Key to the success of the implementation of these standards, of course, are 1, awareness building, and secondly, capacity building. Capacity building, I think, is paramount and important, and is one of the key success factors for Nigeria to be for Africa and Nigeria not to be left behind. It is as a result of this that the FRC Nigeria, alongside the Nigerian Exchange Group, solicited for the support of the International Sustainability Standards Board for us to organize this series of capacity building workshops, which will take place from today over the next 2 to 3 days. Over this period, we expect to have some training on general sustainability disclosures using the SASB standards, as well as industry-based sustainability disclosures in the areas of oil and gas, telecoms, financial services, food, beverages, and consumer goods. So over the next 2-3 days, it will be really exciting. And we are hoping that participants will take time out to fully participate over this period of time. I'm happy to say that the turnout has been very good. I think so far over 800 participants have registered, both from Nigeria and across sister African countries. And I think this is highly, highly commendable. And it's a sign and a proof to the international community that Africa does not want to be left behind this time around. And I want to commend my colleagues from other jurisdictions for joining in this great initiative. And it's also very, very encouraging that African countries are coming together to partner in this capacity building program, because it's clear if Africa is not to be left behind, we don't have the individual jurisdictional financial resources to meet up with developments in the international standards implementation. So it's important, it's a good strategy that African countries are coming together to jointly organize these capacity building programs. I want to appreciate the Nigerian Exchange Group for agreeing to partner with us in this capacity building program. And I want to say that they've been so far worthy partners in this endeavor. I also like to seize the opportunity to appreciate deeply the support that we're getting from the International Sustainability Standards Board. It's clear that ISSB wants implementation of these standards globally. And they've taken time to ensure that Africa is not left behind. And I want to thank Dr. Ndidi, the ISSB board member, who has been very, very, very supportive and has always been encouraging us to always be at par, or at times even ahead of developments internationally in the area of sustainability reporting. Once again, Doctor, thank you so much for that. On this note, once again, I welcome all the participants to these capacity building workshops, and I wish us fruitful, value-adding, knowledge sharing, capacity building over the next 3 days. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Adam Mohamed Shoaibu, for this warm welcome. I would now call on Ms. Tinuade Awe, Chief Executive Officer, NGX Regulation Limited, for our remarks.
Thank you very much, Annie. Good afternoon, good morning, evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to stand on existing protocols, and I'm going to my last notes are very short, because this is not an opportunity for speeches. Moreover, CEO of the Financial Reporting House of Nigeria has really covered the ground of what needs to be said today. All that I would like to add is that NGX Regulation Limited is very pleased to host this capacity building webinar in conjunction with the Financial Reporting House of Nigeria and the ISSB. In preparation for the release of the ISSB's first 2 sustainability disclosure standards, known as General Requirements for Disclosure of Sustainability Financial Information, IFRS S1, and Climate-Related Disclosures, IFRS S2. NGX RegCo is committed to promote a fair, transparent, and orderly market that thrives on full and timely information disclosure for the protection of investors in the Nigerian capital. As a member of the NGX, our commitment to driving sustainability initiatives dates back in time and continues in mind as we partner with organizations such as and ISSB in pursuit of sustainability. So, as you can imagine, we're very pleased to have these capacity sessions. We think that they're very, very important, and that it's important that professionals within sustainability space have the capacity to be able to apply the standards, understand the standards, and also to be able to raise awareness about standards. As I said previously, this is not a time for speeches. I would like to give opportunity to really dig into the material of the afternoon. But if the ready something to close without thanking the Financial Reporting Council of Nigeria and the ISSB for collaborating with us in this segment. And we look forward to much more collaboration then with us as we continue to expand on the prospect of sustainability and standards. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Nadewe, for your warm remarks. Thank you so much. I will now call on Dr. Ndidi Nnoli-Edozien, ISSB board member, to give us our remarks before proceeding into the first presentation for today. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much. I think we have a trend of smaller and shorter speeches, so I'm hoping that I'm going to be the shortest. It will not surprise you that actually in this room from which we're projecting, you will have the Financial Reporting Council of Nigeria, you have NGX RegCo, you have, and both represented by their CEOs, you had the SEC as well, and the Central Bank of Nigeria, and a range of stakeholders, including the Big Four and some of the largest listed preparers. And why are they all convened? Because today the Adoption Readiness Working Group for the adoption of the International Sustainability Standards in Nigeria was inaugurated, which is, I think, well deserving of a big round of applause. And at COP27, Nigeria was announced as the organization, as the corporation, as the country that was going to be the first to early adopt the International Sustainability Standards. And the question is why? And that also alludes to why we have the workshop today, because it's necessary to have comparable, concise, and decision-useful information or sustainability-related and climate-related financial disclosures in order to enable capital markets and investors make investment decisions in a more information-driven way. And that's the reason why we've also organized this workshop in collaboration with the Financial Reporting Council of Nigeria and NGX today, but opened it up to other African regulators and jurisdictions with a view to taking a look at the industry-specific approach to sustainability and climate-related financial disclosures, which is what we're going to work through today. It's a pleasure to be here with my colleagues, Dianora and Arturo. And as the representative of the International Sustainability Standards Board, it's also my great pleasure to open the introduction. And I'm going to ask Arturo to project the slides and provide a context from an S1 and S2 point of view. Dianora is then going to lead in terms of proportionality mechanisms that we have built in to the program in order to ensure that we are building standards that can be applied across large and small companies, across companies that are more prepared and also among those who are less prepared, because what we are trying to do is to reduce the alphabet soup of standards. And Arturo, I think you can already change to the next slide. Reduce the alphabet soup of standards to create one common global baseline that can be applied globally. As we do already know, the IFRS accounting standards are used across 140 countries. And the objective with the IFRS Sustainability Standards is to enable companies provide comprehensive decision-useful sustainability-related and climate-related information to global capital markets. Our objective is to deliver a common language of sustainability-related disclosures. And what we have done is adopted a building block approach, which allows for regulators to put in place a connection between not just the ISSB standards, but also existing local multi-stakeholder information needs and local standards and guidelines that already exist. Altogether, the objective being to meet the information needs of investors globally through this global baseline of sustainability-related disclosures. Arturo, I think you can change to the next slide. What I'll speak to briefly now is the way that we are approaching building the alphabet soup elimination process, namely by essentially collapsing various standards that are mainstream and leaders in their space. And you already are aware of the Task Force Climate-Related Disclosures. You're probably already aware of the SASB Standards, which are industry metrics that we will be deep diving into today. The Climate Disclosure Standards Board and its application guidance has also been embedded in the knowledge base of the IFRS Foundation. And integrated reporting, the integrated reporting framework is also being used to describe sustainability within S1. And the value creation concept has been also built into the way that we have written the IFRS Sustainability Standards S1 and S2. Our end game is to ensure that we're reducing the alphabet soup of standards to create one concise, reliable, comparable set of standards that can be used as a global baseline. Arturo, would you like to move? This is essentially speaking to the building block approach that I just spoke to. The idea is to make things simpler so that on the one hand, you have S1 and S2, but S1 and S2 is interoperable with jurisdiction-specific requirements like you have in Europe, ESRS, and can also be adopted to meet broader multi-stakeholder needs that you may be familiar with, like the GRI standards, so that essentially a comprehensive foundation of disclosures is provided by S1 and S2. What you will learn in a few slides ahead is that S2 is what will be implemented first. And while you are getting acquainted with the disclosure processes of S2, which is climate related, there will be a 1-year relief period for the general sustainability related disclosures, which are both designed to meet investor needs across global capital markets. Go ahead, Arturo. Speaking to S1 in particular, and what the general requirements for sustainability-related disclosures require. As I'd mentioned earlier, the definition of materiality is very much the same as in the accounting standards. So this particular disclosure asks for disclosure of material information about sustainability-related risks and opportunities to meet investor needs. It's structured according to the TCFD 4 pillars, which cover governance, strategy, risks and opportunities, and targets and metrics. And what we will cover today is an insight into the industry-specific disclosures that speak to the 4th pillar, namely targets and metrics. What's important to note is that these standards can be used by companies that report to any GAP. Next slide, please, Arturo. The focus is on consistency and connections between the financial statements and the sustainability disclosures. Ultimately, with the financial statements and the sustainability-related disclosures and climate-related disclosures published at the same time. We'll talk through the transitional reliefs that are being offered in a moment. Doesn't specify a location and allows for additional information to be published alongside the general purpose financial reporting. Carry on, Arturo. The materiality definition, and this is very important to note, in S1 and S2 are exactly the same as you have in the IFRS accounting standards, namely that if information is material, if omitting, misstating, or obscuring it could reasonably be expected to influence investor decisions. Next slide, please, Arturo. And really what we're trying to, building on the integrated reporting framework, is ensure that we're enhancing a company's ability to deliver financial value for investors, which we acknowledge is inextricably linked to the stakeholders with whom it serves and works, the society in which it operates, and of course, the natural resources upon which it draws, which is a nice segue into S2, which will be presented by my colleague. Arturo, you can change slides again. This really just speaks to what I've already talked about, the 4 different pillars of the TCFD: governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets. And the objective is obviously to have sustainability-related and climate-related financial disclosures that are specific to meeting investors' information needs and also facilitate the investment decision-making of these investors and global capital markets. Arturo, please continue. Glad to hand over to you, Dianara, right now to speak us through the S2 standard, especially because the climate-related financial disclosures will be the first that are recommended to become mandatory, and there are significant proportionality measures and scalability measures that have been built into the standard to ensure that they are easily and cost-effectively applicable without undue cost and effort. Over to you, Dianara.
Thank you, Nandini, and it's great to be here with all of you. Delighted with the turnout of 373 participants. I'm going to walk everyone through some of the requirements in S2 and then some of the proportionality mechanisms and reliefs that are designed to make adopting the standards easier for preparers, for regulators, for auditors. So we'll talk through some of that right now, but I'll start with speaking to S2. So Nandini just walked through S1, and the way I think about that is S1 covers human rights, human capital, biodiversity. It covers all of the other standards where we don't necessarily have a standard written yet. And S2 is now a climate standard, and it is specific on the disclosure requirements for climate. So for companies that maybe have other sustainability issues, they look to S1 as a guide on how to disclose that information. S1 has all of the concepts around materiality that Nandini described. So you use S1 to apply these other areas of sustainability, but you also use S1 when applying climate, because you'll need to refer to concepts like materiality and so on and so forth. So I'll start with S2 here. Very similar to what we see in S1, this incorporates the TCFD recommendations. So you'll be applying these disclosures on governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets in the same way that you apply them in S1. There's, of course, the lens of materiality. So all of these disclosures are subject to materiality before they're disclosed. And one of the other things that we'll talk about in detail today is the illustrative guidance for industry-specific metrics that are built on the SASB standards. So I'll go into a bit more detail on the next slide, Arturo. So some of the key concepts, transition planning. So this is a requirement that was proposed in the ED and remained in the final standard that are requiring transition planning disclosures, as well as climate resilience. Now, in the exposure draft, scenario analysis was not required to be conducted. However, during redeliberations, that changed, and now companies will be required to conduct scenario analysis to inform their climate resilience. However, there are many reliefs and proportionality mechanisms to make that disclosure and that scenario analysis simpler. And of course, for climate, the board approved and agreed that companies would have to disclose scope 1, 2, and 3 disclosures. We'll talk about some of the reliefs and mechanisms available there, particularly as it relates to scope 3 emissions. Go to the next slide. So climate-related scenario analysis. So I mentioned that this was not something that had initially been required, but in the final standard, it is now required. But I want to speak to some of the ways that the ISSB improved upon the ED to make this simpler for companies to implement. So we've got here in the blue shaded box, some of what the guidance requires. So a company would be required to use a method of climate-related scenario analysis that is commensurate with the company's circumstances. So what that means is, depending on the company, that can inform how much detail that company goes into to conduct their scenario analysis. And I'll skip to the third bullet. All of these are relief mechanisms designed to just make it easier. So the third bullet speaks to a concept that Minditi hinted at, which is this use of reasonable and supportable information that is available at the reporting date without undue cost or effort. So as companies are applying these standards and working through getting information to then inform their scenario analysis, that information, if it requires undue cost or effort to obtain that information, this is a little bit of a parameter for how much work needs to be done to obtain that information. So that informs the preparers, but it also informs the auditors going and reviewing this information. They also have that parameter that is written into the guidance. I'll also speak to considerations of skills, capabilities, and resources. This is also another proportionality mechanism that will support companies depending on the resources that they have. This will dictate the extent to which they go through the scenario analysis. So I'll go to the next slide. This is just really focused on the application support. So the first thing that we wanted to start with here is just the capacity building efforts that we are focusing on. And, you know, we've got some examples here on the slide, but I think a perfect example of it are these four-part series webinar that we're doing right now, speaking to jurisdictions, walking them through the standard, the reliefs that are available, and so on and so forth. So that has been central to the ISSB's decisions during redeliberations, and now we are acting on those decisions. We can go to the next slide. Okay. This part I think is going to be really important for this group, and just to speak through some of the mechanisms that will support applications. So if you are the preparers preparing this information, here are some of the things that the ISSB decided on that will make implementing the standards easier. So first, we've got the use of well-known terminology and concepts. So a lot of the terminology and concepts that we use in the ISSB standards are leveraged from existing standards from IFRS accounting standards, so that reasonable and supportable information that is available without undue cost or effort that I mentioned on the previous slide, that is actually language that is borrowed from IFRS accounting standards. So where possible, we didn't create new words with new meanings for things. I think materiality is another good example of that, but we leverage what exists to support the ecosystem not needing to relearn that information. We also provide transitional reliefs, which I'll speak to in a minute, but we've got two proportionality mechanisms in the standard, the reasonable and supportable information, and then the consideration of a company's skills, capabilities, and resources. Now, those are applied in different areas throughout the standard. For example, skills, capabilities, and resources are applied to climate scenario analysis and also your connected information. And whereas the reasonable and supportable information is used elsewhere, but those are really introduced in the most challenging parts of the standards to support companies in adopting the standard. Some of the other things that the ISSB did is they're providing guidance within the standard. So within S1 and S2, there will be illustrative guidance, illustrative examples, and application guidance, and this will all provide additional context for applying the standards. So, you know, the application guidance, that'll be mandatory as part of the standards, but it adds more context for what you're doing. So that'll go into the detail on the climate scenario analysis and how it's to be conducted and what we mean by commensurate with the entity's resources. The sources of guidance is absolutely a proportionality mechanism. It's the reason why we're here today. So I'm going to save that one for another minute. But the ISSB, of course, during redeliberations, provided other clarifications throughout the standard. So this is a very high level view of all the things that the ISSB did to make these easier. We'll go through some of these in a bit more detail in the next slide. So these are the type of guidance. So the application guidance, this is mandatory, but it has the additional context for applying the standards. I mentioned that on the previous slide, so maybe I'll spend a bit more time on the educational materials here on the right-hand side of the slide. This is going to be an ongoing process. There are, of course, there are materials that the ISSB has put out to date, different webinars, this webinar, but this is something that will be ongoing. Whereas what's in the blue shaded box are going to come out with the standard. So with the standard, you will have application guidance as well as illustrative guidance. And what is not on the slide are the illustrative examples that will also help companies in, for example, in S1, we have illustrative examples on how to consider your materiality assessment. We can go to the next slide. I see are we getting Q&A? Okay. Release for the first year of application. So I think these are really great reliefs. So the first one, indeed, hinted at the beginning of the session, but the ISSB decided that companies should report on climate first, if that is something that they would like to do. So this is an optional election, but in your first year of reporting, you don't need to report on all of your sustainability risks and opportunities. You only need to report on climate. So that is one of the reliefs. It's optional. But the thing I will say about that is if you apply S2, you of course have to look at S1 for those concepts like materiality, faithful representation, but you're not applying for any other concept besides climate. The timing of reporting. So during the consultation period, we got a lot of feedback that it was important that sustainability related information, financial information, be disclosed at the same time as your financial information. So the ISSB agreed with that, but they also thought that in the first year of reporting, that would be a bit challenging to provide the sustainability disclosures at the same time. So what they agreed to was a 1-year relief where you can, in your first year of reporting, report your sustainability information on a lag. Your scope 3 disclosure, this was a big relief where the ISSB decided that companies could elect to defer reporting on their scope 3 emissions for another year. So in your first year of reporting on S2, you don't need to include your scope 3 emissions. You can report those in the following year. Applying the greenhouse gas protocol. This one is a little nuanced, but basically if you're in a jurisdiction where it's mandatory that you apply an approach to measuring your greenhouse gas emissions that are different from the greenhouse gas protocol, then you can continue to use that process because you're being mandated to do it. However, if you're currently voluntarily using an approach that is different from the greenhouse gas protocol, you have 1 year to transition to following the greenhouse gas protocol. And then of course, comparative reporting. In the first year of reporting, the ISSB decided that comparative information would not be required to be disclosed. We can go to the next slide. I'll quickly check for, okay. Just looking at the Q&A quickly, and I'll try to weave in some of those as I speak. So I wanted to speak a little bit about scope 3 emissions because this is also a challenging area today for companies to measure their scope 3 emissions. And the ISSB wanted to be really clear that they were going to provide support in how companies would adopt this via reliefs, but also in the guidance that they provide. So I spoke to the first relief. You have a year before you have to apply, before you have to disclose your scope 3 emissions. I'll skip down to the bottom two. So your relief, this is one of the areas where you are allowed to apply the concept of reasonable and supportable information that is available without undue cost or effort. And this is going to be incredibly helpful for companies as they're going through their value chain, especially in the first years of reporting, to get information. It's going to be challenging. So we put that relief here so that companies have that parameter on what they're using when preparing this disclosure. One thing that I haven't talked about is the last bullet here is this scope 3 measurement framework. So the ISSB agreed that they would, in the application guidance of S2, which will be released at the same time as the standard, that they would include guidance for how a company will measure its scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions. And this, of course, permits the use of estimating. We can skip to the next slide. I'm going to quickly also, just because I'm seeing these questions here now, just asking for a bit more detail on how these proportionality mechanisms can benefit SMEs. That's a great question. And one of the things I'll say about the proportionality mechanisms when you think about it is, as they're applied in the first year, maybe an SME has fewer skills, capabilities, and resources. They don't have the resources. Maybe it's a larger company. So they can really avail of that proportionality mechanism and potentially not quantify information that would otherwise need to be quantified. So, but as the SME reports year over year, they'll gradually improve in how they prepare that disclosure. And, you know, over time, they will obtain those skills and the resources to prepare that disclosure. So the proportionality mechanisms are a bit elastic. They evolve with the company. And so they will help SMEs as their SMEs, and also if and as they grow to larger companies, but really as they mature and they're reporting on this information after a few years. This is really the punchline of what I wanted to talk about today, because this feeds into and guides us into the conversation we're going to be having over the next few days, which is about the SASB standards. So in S1, we have these sources of guidance. So this is the guidance for considering which risks and opportunities to disclose, which is on the left-hand side of the slide, and then which metrics to potentially disclose on the right-hand side of the slide. So we'll start on the left. And one of the things that the ISSB decided was, you know, it's going to take a few years maybe to prepare, to create a standard on biodiversity, on human rights, on human capital. It's going to take time. And so in the meantime, we need to enable companies to prepare disclosures on these areas without our standards. So they, on the left-hand side, which risks and opportunities, the ISSB decided that companies so they can refer to and consider the SASB standards when they're identifying which risks and opportunities to report on. So this is an interesting requirement, right? Because the ISSB is saying that you shall, which means you must. They're saying you must consider. So that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to disclose in accordance with the SASB standards, but you must consider them. And this is going to be a really helpful mechanism, because if you're a company that's reporting on areas for the first time, you can look to the SASB standards and they will give you a clue as to what areas you might need to consider report on. And Arturo is going to show you what all that means in the next session that we're going to speak through. So the shall consider has more emphasis than what we have under what may consider. So this is an optional consideration, but companies may also consider these other sources of guidance in preparing their disclosures. They're listed on the left-hand side here. And then the right-hand side, we have basically the same concept. This is when, you know, you don't have an ISSB standard to refer to. So when there isn't excuse me, when there isn't the ISSB standard to refer to, again, you shall consider SASB standards, and that you may consider these other areas. So again, so this I think will be a really good tee up into what Arturo is going to talk about. I think that we might have one other slide. Yes. So how to prepare. So this is just a helpful slide on what you can be doing in the meantime. You can take a look at the exposure drafts, but seeing as the final standards are going to be coming out at the end of this month, maybe just expect that publication at the end of the month and take a read through that. Of course, consider the other frameworks that have been influential in developing the ISSB standards. I would definitely recommend subscribing to the ISSB updates and listening to the monthly podcast. So the monthly podcasts are great because they summarize 2-hour-long meetings in about 15 minutes, and they're hyperlinked on the slide. I think that's it for me. I think we have an MC for the Q&A. Is that right?
Yes. Thank you very much, Diana. So we'll just move straight into the Q&A. So the very first one here says, would you be able to go into more detail on if or how proportionality can benefit SMEs?
Thanks for that one. I did see that pop up as I was speaking, and I think I answered that one as I was going. But basically, you will be able to apply these proportionality mechanisms. They are flexible, so the smaller the company, the fewer resources they have, they can avail of that. They can avail of that to a greater extent than maybe a larger company with more resources.
All right, thank you. This one says, how will the FRC and NGX RegCo support accountants and auditors in the reporting and auditing of sustainability information? I'm sure, Ms. Awe, would you like to answer this, or do I direct this to I think your microphone is on mute. Your audio is coming up. Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. So I think one of the first things is that even having this capacity building event is aimed at starting the process of supporting the accountants and the auditors and the preparers, because the categories of persons that will need support in order to do this are not limited to the auditors and the accountants. So these types of capacity building sessions are aimed at that. Apart from that, I think everyone heard when the ES and NDD talked about the Adoption Readiness Working Group, which is a creation of the FRC supported by the ISSB as well, where basically a group of people are being put together in order to help and advise and recommend to the FRC a roadmap for getting to the adoption of the standards fully in Nigeria. And so these issues around what should be done to support the accountants and the auditors to ensure that they're in a position to play their role for the standards to be properly adopted is on the agenda for this group. I think particularly with the accountants, they are the ones that prepare the financial reports. They're the ones that will also be grappling as an initial matter as preparers are working to prepare each company's financial reports. I think the auditors may come at a later stage because, as you know, the auditors are in the assurance category. And so I think these matters are already being taken on hand. And I would say that people should watch this space and people should continue contributing to the conversation so that as we go along, all their needs are taken into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Awer. Ambassador Shoaibu, would you like to add any more comments on this? Okay.
Why don't you go on to another question, and then he can come back. And this is a question I think that can even be answered after the second presentation. It remains relevant. Thank you, Annie.
All right. S2 is basically a disclosure standard focusing more on the qualitative climatic effect. This is, of course, very technical and needs climate experts to appropriately meet disclosure requirements. For many SMEs, the proportionality test might render S2 immaterial. Are we to conclude that S2 will be relevant to only large companies?
So this is definitely no. We are not to conclude that S2 would be relevant only to large companies. So let me clarify one thing. The proportionality mechanisms are designed to help companies to consider what information they use to prepare disclosures and what they can do, with their skills, with their resources, and so on to prepare the disclosures. They are not a get out of jail free card from providing their disclosures. They just make the process for preparing the disclosures easier to do. So the disclosures, the determination for whether or not the climate information is material would not be impacted by the proportionality mechanisms in the standards.
All right, thank you very much, Nora. This one says, to clarify the comparative information, do you mean that in the second year when companies disclose information about both climate-related and other sustainability-related risks and opportunities, companies are not mandated to disclose the comparative information for the sustainability disclosures, but are required to disclose only the climate-related disclosures as comparatives?
Really great question. This was discussed at length at the April ISSB board meeting when they introduced this relief. So I think as it was summarized here, you're correct. So if you take advantage of the relief where you report on climate first, and then in year 2, everything else, I'll walk you through that timeline. So year one, you provide your climate disclosures. Year two, you provide your climate disclosures and the comparative information for climate, and your first year, all other sustainability disclosures, but you are not required to provide the comparatives on that. And then then the following year, you then would have all of the comparatives. So great pickup. That's a really nuanced question, and I hope that answered it.
All right, thank you. This person. Okay,
I know, just
all
very
right.
quickly, on behalf of FRC and who just stepped out, in response to the question that was raised, in every jurisdiction, in every country, there are capacity building programs being developed. And this particular program is one of such. And so on the one hand, I think the question was related to how will the FRCN support SMEs in particular as well. And I think there it's just very important to note that unlike the accounting standards, where there is an IFRS for SMEs, these standards have been written so that they are proportional, which is why we had that second segment on climate-related financial disclosures. And what's really important to note is that there is a relief for 1 year on scope 3. And what is really important about scope 3 to understand is that 70% of these emissions are in the value chain. So they are smaller entities of an industry value chain. And therefore, you know, it's very important that when organizations, especially larger organizations, are looking at these standards, that they're also having conversations around their entire business model and their value chain. And in this context, the conversations that are ongoing is how best that capacity building and support will be provided, so that beyond illustrative guidance, the best thing for you to do really is come June 26th, pick up the standards, take a look at them. And what you'll find throughout the rest of this workshop now is that we will focus on the industry metrics, which is an entry point into S1 and S2, and are designed as proportionality measures to make this easier for you to understand which are the metrics and targets that are likely to be financially material to your organization.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ndidi. This one says, with the IFRS S1 and S2 set to be finalized in June 2023, how can organizations begin to prepare for the adoption of IFRS S1 and S2 standards? Are you working with sustainability consultants and professional service firms to assist companies for the adoption of the standards? So I don't know if Dr. Ndidi wants to take this or...
And I can start, Ndidi, if that's helpful. So, the professional services firms, for example, EY, they are preparing, they're working through their audit methodology. They're replying to the ISSB and other proposals that exist to ready the auditing infrastructure of this information. If I was a company right now, I would be listening to the ISSB podcast and reading the most recent, the standards when they do come out. But there will be a lot of conferences, the educational materials that I referred to earlier that will come out, that will also provide deeper level insights on what companies can be doing.
All right, thank you. This person wants to know if the sustainability reporting is applicable to every sector, including agriculture and transportation.
Yes.
Okay. This question says,
I think I know that this is the perfect segue to lead into and allow Arturo to begin his presentation, because a lot of the responses are actually in his presentation also, and that we say, please keep sending your questions in. Arturo, please take over and take us through the industry-based metrics, which also gives us an overview of how broad scoped the metrics and targets related to the industry-specific standards are.
Thank you, Ndidi, and thank you everybody for your interest in the work of the ISSB, and in particular for today's session, the importance of the SASB standards in S1 and S2. I will try to answer some of the questions that remain in the chat, but please do keep them coming so that we can take advantage of this time to answer as many questions as possible. So this second section of the day will focus specifically on the SASB standards. And I hope it was clear from Indidi's and Dianora's presentations that the SASB standards are a key component of S1 and S2 alongside other existing frameworks and standards like the TCFD recommendations and the integrated reporting framework. The idea for the rest of the session today is to give you an introduction to the SASB standards. I'll try to explain what they are not, because there is some confusion of what they are and what they're not. I'll also speak a little bit about the history of the development of the SASB standards so that you get a clear understanding of how these standards were developed over 10 years ago and what the value proposition of the SASB standards is, as well as give you some context as to what information the SASB standards are designed to provide investors. I have 2 slides on market support for the SASB standards, both in terms of the investor support for the use of the industry-based SASB standards, as well as some figures on the number of companies worldwide that use these standards to report information related to financial materiality specific to their industries. And finally, the last portion of my presentation will focus on a resource that we call the SASB Standard Implementation Primer. And this is a resource available online. It's free, that will help companies produce SASB standards aligned reports. So that's the idea for the rest of the day today. Again, please do include Q&As as you hear me speak. And then I want to start with key takeaways from the first hour that relate to the SASB standards. I hope it was clear that the ISSB standards and the IFRS Foundation is building upon existing frameworks and standards that up until now have been have been designed for voluntary use. This includes the TCFD recommendations, as we have discussed, also the integrated reporting framework and the SASB standards. S1, as you hopefully know by now, references the SASB standard as priority material to help companies identify risks and opportunities that could impact an organization's ability to create value. This was the whole conversation on shall consider the SASB standards when selecting topics and metrics that Dianora helped us walk through a few minutes ago. Then for IFRS S2, which is the climate document, you saw on the first portion of the presentation that this document is accompanied by industry-based illustrative guidance, which incorporates climate-related metrics taken and improved from the SASB standards. So again, there's a link between S2 and SASB, and it's one of the reasons we are actually here speaking about the SASB standards. And finally, the last takeaway from the first hour of our conversation is that, as you saw on that last slide that Dianora presented, the ISSB encourages organizations to adopt the SASB standards to get prepared to implement S1 and S2. And this goes back to that question that we had earlier on how to get prepared to implement S1 and S2 when they become available at the end of the month. So with that in mind, let's go a little bit on and provide you an example of how S1 and S2 interact with each other and how the SASB standards fit into that interaction. So again, this has been discussed by Dianora, but I really wanted to make sure that you guys understand and have visibility on how S1 and S2 relate to each other and how the SASB standards fit into the equation. So as you may recall, S1 requires preparers to disclose information that is material to their investors on all sustainability-related risks and opportunities. If a company, after conducting its materiality assessment, decides and determines that climate change is one of those risks and opportunities that impact their ability to create value and hence are important for the investors, then that company, that preparer, will need to use IFRS S2 to disclose information related to climate change. And that includes looking at the illustrative industry-based guidelines that has taken the climate-related metrics from the SASB standards and included in those guidance. Now, for other topics that are not climate change related, an organization shall consider the SASB standards for information on sustainability topics apart from climate that may be relevant to investors, as well as those metrics that accompany those topics. And you can see that in the illustration on the right-hand side, right? IFRS S1 again asks you to determine which topics are material for your company. If climate change is one of them, you then are referred to using IFRS S2. And for the other topics where there's no IFRS Sustainability Standard, then you shall consider the SASB standards for topics and metrics. And you can consider other resources like GRI and the European standards, for example, as long as these other resources provide information that's relevant for investors. So again, that's the basics and that's the context of how the SASB standards relate to IFRS S1 and IFRS S2. And hopefully that gives you an idea of why the information that's going to be presented next is of, it's very important for the correct implementation of S1 and S2. So with that in mind, let's go with a high-level introduction of the SASB standards, what they are, what they intend to capture through their disclosures, and what is the value proposition of the SASB standards. So the first thing that you need to know is that the SASB standards were developed over 10 years ago to connect businesses and investors on the financial impacts of sustainability in a given industry. And you can see on the right-hand side of this slide that there are 6 pillars upon which the SASB standards were created, again, over 10 years ago. The first pillar is that of investor relevant information. So the SASB standards were developed and designed to provide investors with relevant information on the sustainability topics that would impact the common company within a given industry. The second pillar is industry specific. And as you'll see in the next couple of slides, the SASB standards were developed to raise and identify the risks and opportunities related to sustainability factors in the context of a given industry. Why? Because it's very important to recognize that the sustainability risks and opportunities and profiles of a company participating in one industry are very different from the sustainability risks and opportunities of a company participating in another industry or sector based on the types of capitals that that company uses to create, preserve, and preserve value. The third pillar is the pillar of market informed. As you'll see again in a couple of slides, the SASB standards were designed through a process where the SASB standards team reached out to some stakeholders in the marketplace to get their feedback on which sustainability topics were important for a given industry, for companies participating in a given industry. Moving to the next pillar, the evidence-based pillar. This basically shows that the SASB standards were designed with evidence of financial impact in mind, again, to make them decision useful, which is the fifth pillar for both companies and investors. And finally, the last pillar is the pillar of the cost effectiveness, which, as you will hopefully see in, again, a few slides, the SASB standards do focus on a limited set of sustainability topics and metrics, and that makes them more cost effective. Ndidi hinted on the cost effectiveness of the SASB standards earlier on, saying that the SASB standards were a tool to get companies started in their sustainability disclosure. And part of that is based on the cost effectiveness of the SASB standards, because again, they focus on a subset of topics that are relevant to investors rather than on a broader set of sustainability topics in general. So I'll walk through the next slides, and these next 4 or 5 slides do touch upon these 6 pillars that I just briefly explained. So again, going back to this idea that the SASB standards are investor relevant, why is this so? Because they were designed to help companies identify those sustainability topics that are reasonably likely to affect the financial condition, operating performance, or risk profile of organizations within a given industry. So again, by using the SASB standards, the idea is to disclose information that a reasonable investor would consider relevant for its decision-making processes. The second pillar, as you may remember, is that of industry specificity. You can see here in this slide that there are 77 SASB standards for different industries that are categorized in 11 different sectors. You see there that there are these 77 industries, including the ones that we will be exploring tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, which are the telecommunications industry, the oil and gas industries, the consumer goods and food and beverage sectors, as well as the financial sectors. And again, it's very important to understand this particular aspect of the SASB standards because intuitively we know that a company participating in, for example, the apparel industry has very different risks and opportunities related to sustainability than a company participating in, say, transportation or in banking. The type of resources that a company uses to produce value for its investors is, again, very different depending on the type of industry that that company participates in. And the SASB standards are designed to raise risk and opportunities within a given industry and take into account these differences from sector to sector and from industry to industry. So moving on, I'll talk a little bit about how the SASB standards were developed, again, over 10 years ago. And the first thing that I want you to know is that for every single industry that you just saw listed on the last slide, the SASB standards development team started with a hypothesis that any of these 30 or so sustainability topics could be relevant for investors. The SASB standards have this architecture where there's different sustainability topics categorized in these 5 categories: environment, social capital, human capital, business model and innovation, and leadership and governance. And altogether, there are 30 something sustainability topics that at the beginning we thought could be financially material for a company. However, the process that the SASB standards development team followed was the following. To start with this universe of 30 so sustainability issues, and then based on our own research, as well as reaching out to the market for feedback and creating industry working groups and conducting consultations with companies, investors, NGOs, academics, etc., we started filtering that initial universe of 30 sustainability issues and trim it down so that it could focus entirely on the topics that are important for investors only. So after this process of filtering the initial universe of 30 sustainability issues, the final SASB standards on average contain 6 topics and 13 metrics. And this also talks again on the cost effectiveness of the SASB standards. Instead of producing a report with information on multiple topics, let's say, 30 topics, 35 topics, you can use the SASB standards to focus on the disclosure topics that are relevant to investors and make your disclosure more manageable in terms of the amount of information that you are providing to the market. Next, this slide talks a little bit about the 4th and 5th pillar, which is the pillar of the evidence-based and decisional usefulness. And let me try to unpack this slide for you. So what you see here on the first row are examples of disclosure topics that you would see included in the SASB standards for the industries that are in parentheses. So for example, if you were to download the SASB standards for the restaurant industry, you would see that there's one topic included there that relates to food safety. If you were to download the SASB standard for the airline industry, you would see, among other topics, a topic that relates to fuel management and so forth. And what I want to show here is that all the different topics that are included in the SASB standard have a dual nature of being important in terms of financial impacts across the different elements that we know from financial statements, as well as environmental, social, or governance importance. And the most intuitive example that I can give you so that we can get this point across is that of the airline industry. So if we think of the airline industry, we know that transporting customers and clients as well as goods across cities and countries requires a lot of fuel. And fuel is the most important cost component for companies in the airline industry. And of course, that has repercussions in a company's income statement. But we also know intuitively that fuel management has implications for climate change. As fuel is burned in air travel, it contributes to climate change and the concentration of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. So again, with this example, you see that all the topics in the SASB standards have implications on traditional elements on the financial statements, in this case, the cost structure of airline operators, as well as environmental, social, or governance impacts, in this case, environmental impacts through the release of greenhouse gas emissions to the air. And this is true for every single topic in the SASB standards. They relate to, in one hand, to financial impacts and elements on the income statement, balance sheet, or cash flows, but also on sustainability related information. And again, all these idea of having these dual impacts and dual connections make the information provided in the SASB standards decision useful for both companies as well as investors. So the final result of this whole process of filtering, identifying topics that are related to financial impact, providing, getting feedback from the market, et cetera, is a set of 77 industry-specific standards that can be downloaded from the website that you see listed there for free. The SASB standards are free for use. And all these standards include a table like the one you see on the slide. This table includes a list of disclosure topics for each industry. It also includes metrics to measure performance on each topic. And the SASB standards also include technical protocols that aid companies with data collection. Finally, the SASB standards are also include activity metrics that help normalize the sustainability information that companies are disclosing. So basically, metrics that companies can use as the denominators to normalize the information presented to their investors. So the next couple of slides will give you examples of the diversity in metrics that the SASB standards have for the same topic, depending on the industry that we're focusing on. The first example that I want to give you is that of ecological impacts. At first glance, ecological impacts seems like a very generic, homogeneous topic. But as you see here with the examples presented, the metric required to measure ecological impacts in different industries is very different and needs to be different. So we have an example from the oil and gas exploration and production industry, where the SASB metric that is linked to the topic of ecological impacts reads as follows. It's the percentage of proved and probable reserves that are near sites of protective conservation status or near endangered species habitats. If you look at the indicator or metric for the marine transportation and cruise line industry, the metric for ecological impacts is completely different. And it's the percentage of fleet that it's implementing ballast water, which is a type of technology implemented by the maritime industry to reduce biodiversity impacts. And finally, if you look at the third example for the meat, poultry, and dairy industry, the SASB metric that is linked to ecological impacts has to do with the amount of litter, animal litter, and manure generated by the operations of a company, as well as the percentage of that litter that is managed according to a nutrient management plan. So again, these are just 3 examples of how to think of ecological impacts in the context of different industries. And these again highlights the value of the SASB standards because we are using concepts and language that each industry uses already to try to understand the sustainability related risks and opportunities of that given industry. Here is another example. We're moving past ecological impacts and we are looking at physical impacts of climate change. Before I go into the examples, I want to note that since these are climate-related metrics, these metrics are part of S2's illustrative industry-based guidance, and you will find them once the ISSB standards are published at the end of the month in those illustrative guidance that accompany S2. So again, from a starting point, if we think of physical impacts of climate change, it might seem like a very generic, homogeneous topic. But again, if we look at the way in which we can measure physical impacts of climate change in the insurance industry versus the real estate industry versus the hospital or healthcare delivery industry, the metric that you see there is different. And that is just a reflection of the sustainability profile of each of these industries. For insurance, we are talking about the amount of monetary losses that are related to payouts that are due to natural catastrophes, both modeled and non-modeled. For the real estate industry, the SASB standards ask companies to report on the area of properties in their portfolio that are prone to flooding. And for the hospital or healthcare delivery industry, one of the metrics is qualitative and asks for companies to describe the policies and practices that they have to address the physical risks to their infrastructure, as well as changes in morbidity and mortality rates attributed to or associated to climate change. So again, I'm sorry for being so repetitive, but it is very important to understand the value of the SASB standards to these examples. The SASB standards provide different metrics, different indicators to provide information on a generic topic like physical impacts of climate change. And that's why companies and investors are using them worldwide, because they see value in having this industry-specific, industry-based disclosure information. And that's actually a good segue to the next section of my presentation, which talks about the market support for the SASB standards. I'll start with investors. The legacy SASB organization, which is now, of course, part of the ISSB and the IFRS Foundation, created a program called the SASB Alliance that has morphed into the IFRS Sustainability Alliance. And this is a group of investors that promote the use of the SASB standards in the companies that they invest. As you can see, over the years, the amount of organizations that are part of the IFRS Sustainability Alliance has been growing, and we now have more than 340 investors from 31 jurisdictions that manage a lot of money, over $81 trillion in assets under management, that are part of this IFRS Sustainability Alliance and that are asking companies to use the SASB standards in their industry-based disclosures. On the other side of the coin, if you will, we have also been measuring corporate use of the SASB standards. Since 2021, we have identified over 2,700 organizations that are using the SASB standards to report sustainability-related information for their industry to their investors. You can see the breakdown there for different regions of the world. And of course, relevant to this webinar here You can see that the number of Africa-based organizations that are using SASB standards is relatively low compared to other regions in the world. And that's exactly why we're having this conversation today, to, of course, create capacity building and create awareness of these industry-based standards. So we hope to see those numbers for Middle East and Africa increase in the coming years, especially as S1 and S2 are released at the end of this month. So the last portion of my presentation will focus on the SASB implementation primer. We have at this point talked about the SASB standards in general, how they were developed, what's their value, what are the main components of the SASB standards. And for the rest of the conversation today, I want to focus on practical information that you can have in order to implement the SASB standards as you prepare for S1 and S2. So the SASB implementation primer is a resource, free resource that's available online. You can see the URL there at the bottom of the slide. And this is basically a guide that accompanies companies in their reporting journeys to provide SASB-aligned sustainability reports. This implementation primer is divided in 7 different sections, as you see listed on the slide. And it starts from helping companies establish a foundation to start their path towards disclosure of sustainability information. The second step is choosing the right tools to develop reports tailored to the needs of each audience. The third step is to determine the best channel for the disclosure of sustainability information. And the fourth step is understanding the structure of the SASB standards and their different components. Then you move to assessing information gaps. What information do you have right now, and what information do you need in the future? Finally, the last 2 steps in the implementation primer talk about actually developing your report with information aligned to the SASB standards. And the last step talks about how to continuously improve your reporting using the SASB standards. One important thing to note for the implementation primer is that you don't need to start from step 1 to make it useful. Depending on the sophistication of each company might decide to start at the beginning or midway through some of these steps in order to create SASB-aligned reports. It really depends on the experience that each company has in reporting with sustainability information and other standards and frameworks. One other thing to note about the SASB implementation primer is that each one of those steps that I described before includes a document at the end, which basically is a checklist that includes key questions and actions that companies should consider in order to move to the next step. So this is a very useful resource to, I guess, check your work before you move on to the next step. I won't have time to go through all of the steps in the implementation primer, but I do want to focus on some of the information presented in some of these in these steps. So I'll start with step 2, which is helping companies decide which tools to use to report sustainability information depending on the audiences that they want to reach with their disclosure. What you see here is the 4 pillars of the TCFD recommendations that both Ndidi and Dianora mentioned during their presentations: governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. And you can see that the SASB standards fit squarely in the metrics and targets pillar, or concentric circle here in this case. So this idea of using different tools to speak to different audiences is key in this step in the implementation primer. And as you can see from the images to the left, this idea of using different standards and different frameworks together to talk to investors is what drives the information that's included in S1 and S2. Because again, as a reminder, S1 and S2 build upon the principles and concepts and indicators from the TCFD recommendations and the SASB standards, as well as the integrated reporting framework. If we move on to the third step of the implementation primer, this step helps companies determine which channels are better suited for sustainability disclosures. There is information on the different pros and cons, benefits and drawbacks from reporting sustainability information in different types of reports, including annual reports, integrated reports, sustainability reports, SASB reports. And one thing to note here that relates back to S1 and the work of the ISSB is that the ISSB is agnostic in where the information needs to be included. The information related to S1 and S2 needs to be included. The ISSB is leaving that decision to jurisdictions to say companies should report ISSB information on this document or this other document. That really depends on each jurisdiction. But this step in the implementation primer does cover some of the pros and cons of including sustainability disclosure in different types of publications. If we move to the fourth step in the implementation primer, we start to dig deeper into how to use the SASB standards and what are the different components of the SASB standards architecture. And one of the first questions that companies normally ask themselves is what SASB standard do I need to look at in order to disclose industry-based information? So for that particular answer, we do have a tool online that helps companies identify which SASB standard it is recommended for them to use. And hopefully you can see these two illustrations, even though the font is small, but these are screenshots from the tool that we have online. And basically what this tool does is allow any company, any user to include the name of a company or the ticker of that company and search for the recommended SASB standard that they should consider using. So the example here is from General Motors. If you go to this tool online and you click General Motors, you will be shown the following result, which is General Motors should use the should consider the automobile SASB standard, which is part of the transportation sector. Similarly, for J&J, which is the ticker for Johnson & Johnson, the tool will show that this particular company should consider the SASB standards for the biotechnology and pharmaceutical industry. And we have mapped over 90,000 companies globally in this tool. So chances are that the company that you represent is listed there and that you will get an answer to which standard should I use. The second part of the question of a selection of standards is if a company should consider multiple standards depending on its operations. Different companies have different business models and have different operations across multiple industries or a single industry. So each company needs to decide on its own if it needs to report more than one standard, depending on the information that they want to provide to their investors. I'm giving you here 3 examples of companies that currently use the SASB standards. Again, if we go back to the General Motors example, their business model is quite simple. They're an automaker and they only use the SASB standards for the automobiles industry. But for example, AT&T, which is a telecommunication company, uses the telecommunication SASB standard as its primary standard, but they also have a arm that relates to media and entertainment. So they also use the SASB topics and the SASB metrics for that other standard. And finally, Johnson & Johnson uses biotech and pharma as its main standard, but they do have other business units that operate in the medical equipment and the personal products industries. So they also use these standards to identify sustainability risks and opportunities related to value creation and that are relevant to investors. So moving on, after a company has decided to which SASB standards to use for its disclosures, the next step is to select which topics are relevant to disclose. And here we have 3 scenarios basically that you can see in different colors. The first one is that all the topics included in the SASB standards are applicable to the organization's operations. That's the one in red. The next scenario is that the SASB standards include topics that are not relevant to the operations of a given organization. There may be 1 or 2 topics that are not particularly relevant for a company looking at that standard. Finally, the last scenario is that the SASB standards do not include a topic that an organization considers important for disclosure to its investors. So again, taking into consideration these 3 scenarios, what do companies need to do? And that's described in the dotted rectangles to the right-hand side of the colored boxes. So the first thing that you need to know is that for all the topics that are applicable to the operations of your company, the suggestion, of course, is to use the metrics that are provided by the SASB standards to report information on those topics. But what to do in the scenarios in blue? If you recall, the scenario in dark blue is that not all the topics in the SASB standards are applicable to the operations in a given for a given company. So let's say, for example, that the SASB standards for the chemical industry has 11 different sustainability topics, but that one of those topics is not relevant for the company that's using that standard. The suggestion for that scenario is to use the report or explain principle. And this basically means that companies are encouraged to include all topics in their disclosure. And then for the ones that are not applicable, they can always provide an explanation as to why that particular topic is not applicable, and they are not providing the information that is required by the metric. And then finally, for the third scenario, which again was that the SASB standard does not include a relevant topic that the company considers applicable and it desires to disclose, the recommendation is to look at other SASB standards that do include the topic, or as you saw in throughout the presentation, there may be other resources like GRI or the European Sustainability Reporting Standards that may aid with the addition of topics that are not included in the SASB standards per se. So moving on, I want to give you an example of what a true SASB report looks like. This is from General Motors again, the automobile company. And we are here to highlight some of the good practices from companies using SASB reports. So the first thing that you should note is that this company has included all the topics and metrics within the SASB standard for its industry, as well as the activity metrics that help us normalize the sustainability information disclosed. The company also includes codes for each metric. I haven't mentioned this, but each metric in the SASB standard is accompanied by a unique code. So including those codes in your disclosure is good practice so that both humans and machines can identify that a given paragraph or a given metric, a given figure is related to that unique disclosure topic and disclosure metric. Also, in terms of good practice, the limited use of links is encouraged. We have seen through time that many companies in producing their sustainability reports reference other documents or reference other pages within a document. And sometimes the use of links to other documents are broken. So that, of course, makes it difficult for investors and users of this information to look what they're to find what they're looking for. So the best practice here is to include the performance data, both qualitative and quantitative, next to the SASB metric and the SASB metric code. Again, that will facilitate the lecture, the reading of the report, and the finding of the information that's related to financial value. And finally, as a last point of good practice, I want to show you that some companies do include historical data that helps users of the information to understand trends. And this speaks again to some of the requirements in S1 of comparative data that Dianora walked us through. I also want to take a few seconds to show you that the SASB aligned report for General Motors is what you see here. And this also talks about the cost effectiveness of reporting with the SASB standards. Instead of having a huge sustainability report that focuses on many different elements, if you want to speak to your investors and you use the SASB standards, you can produce a report aligned with the SASB standards that fits in one page, like the one here for General Motors. This slide here talks about also another set of good practices in the development of SASB aligned reports. You can see this example from BlackRock, the asset management in the United States. And here, they are reporting information on employee diversity and inclusion. The SASB standard for this particular topic requires to disclose information on the amount of the percentage of your employees that are male versus female and other different characteristics. And that, as you can see in the image here, is presented on the right-hand side. What BlackRock has done for this particular disclosure is that they have also added qualitative context in order for users of this information to have more transparency and have more information on the metrics being provided and on the numbers being provided. So that's another best practice. Always accompany your quantitative information with a little bit of context if you can, because that helps, again, bring more clarity into your performance on those particular topics. Finally, I want to end with a couple of other resources. These are beyond the SASB implementation primer that are available for companies and investors and that can help with the implementation of the SASB standards. I mentioned the IFRS Sustainability Alliance earlier. This is the group, the membership program that includes investors from around the world, as well as other sustainability and ESG practitioners. And this is a membership program. Members of this program get educational resources that are focused exclusively on the SASB standards and are invited to exclusive events, et cetera, et cetera. This is a link, so when I share the presentation, you can access this link here to learn more about the IFRS Sustainability Alliance. We also have a licensing program that's called SASB Inside. This is geared to our investors that want to integrate an industry-based lens into their decision-making. And you can find out more on our licensing webpage. And we also have an FSA credential, which is an educational certification program that is designed for consultants, sustainability professionals, and financial analysts that looks at industry-based sustainability disclosures. So again, you can find out more by following this link on the slide. So before we go into Q&A, I just want to remind everybody of what's coming next in the next few days. Tomorrow, we have 2 industry deep dives where we will walk through what are the main trends in sustainability disclosure for the oil and gas sector, starting at 3 p.m., and then also the telecommunication services industry, starting at 4 p.m. Again, these are industry-based sessions. So if you are operating in any of these industries, oil and gas and telecommunication services, please do join us tomorrow for more information on the SASB standards for these particular sectors and industries. On day 3, we have kind of the same idea of having deep dives, but this time for the financial sector at 3 p.m. And for the food and beverage and consumer goods sectors at 4 p.m. So again, if you are participating in any of these industries, please do join us tomorrow or the day after tomorrow to get more information on what these SASB standards mean for these industries. So with that, I would like to open for questions on the SASB standards, or if you still have questions on the ISSB standards, please do also include those in the chat. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Atutu. Thank you very much. We will now proceed to the questions. I know there were some questions that came from the last session and then questions in the comments. So I'll just go right into it. This one says, fintech and payment industry is not covered specifically in the industries listed. What companies in that sector therefore adopt standards across industries? Or is there plan to include this sector subsequently?
Yeah, so we don't plan to create new sectors or industries in the short term. So what companies in this particular scenario can do is look at different standards that may be applicable. So for fintech, for example, I can think of some of the industries within the financial sector, like consumer finance or commercial banks, or insurance, depending on what the fintech company is focusing on. But also complement that disclosure with looking at the software and IT services industry. Again, fintech companies are this combination of financial operations with technology operations, right? So it makes sense for these types of companies to look at relevant industries in the financial sector, as well as relevant industries in the technology sector, including software and IT services.
All right, thank you very much, Atu. Please let me also remind you that you could please send more questions as Atu continues with the responses. Okay, I think that's already been answered. After adoption, is it necessary to disclose or report sustainability progress? Secondly, at the first adoption, is it required to report sustainability retrogressively for comparison?
Thank you, Larne, for that question. I'll answer that, and Dianora, if you want to weigh in also, please feel free to do so. So the ISSB S1 and S2, as Dianora explained earlier on, do require to provide comparative information in year 2. So Dianora walked us through an example of how companies that are taking into consideration the relief provision to disclose climate-related information on year 1, and then start disclosing information on all other non-climate-related topics in year 2, can provide comparative information for climate after the first year, and then provide comparative information on all sustainability-related topics in what would be year 3. So it is considered in S1 and S2. And from the perspective of the SASB standards, it is also encouraged to provide historical information, because again, it lets investors understand the progress being made towards the sustainability targets that a company has established for itself.
Thank you very much, Atu. This one says, just give me a minute. For holding companies comprising of hospitality, steam or hydro power generation, technology, healthcare, and energy businesses, will such a holdco be expected to disclose all of these as is applicable to the respective industries, or select per area?
So I'll give a perspective from the SASB standards. We unfortunately do not have a holding company industry standard that takes into consideration, the operations of holding companies. But we do have, as I said, 77 different industries and 77 different standards. So what holding companies can do is grab one SASB standard for their main type of operation and use it as an anchor and core for the disclosure. And if they are being demanded by their investors to provide information on other areas of their business, they should consider the SASB standards for the other industries in their operations and disclose information that's relevant to investors from those industries as well. One of the limitations of the tool that I showed you, the online tool where you include the name of the company or the ticker, is that it will show only the primary industry that we suggest a company to use. But again, if a company has a very complex business model, including like a holding company, then it needs to decide for itself which other SASB standards it may use to provide investors with relevant information on its entirety of operations.
Thank you very much. Let me see if there are more questions for you to take.
I see a question there. Sorry, Anu, but I see a question there on what to do if your company is not listed in the SASB classification, and I think that's important. If you look at the SASB website and that particular area where you can include the company name or the company ticker, there is a way for contacting the SASB team in case your company is not listed. You can fill out a very simple form saying, my company is not listed. Can you please list it in this particular industry? And we will do so to help you with the implementation of the SASB standards.
All right, thank you very much, Arturo. I'd like to direct this question. This is to Ambassador Shoaib, and it says, how can the standards be used by companies including, or can the standards be used by companies including HoldCo and overall use as entry into S1 and S2 reporting? Ambassador, would you like to take this? How the standards will be used by companies including HoldCo and overall use as entry into S1 and S2 reporting?
Yeah.
I think your microphone is muted. Hello, can you hear me? Okay, so perhaps we'll just take the next question. I think there's something wrong with the audio. But Arturo, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay. This question says, on the industry-specific metrics, re-impact, what guidance do you have for instances where data is insufficient, unreliable, or not available?
That's a very good question. Thank you for making it. So from the SASB standards perspective, and this also is considered in the ISSB standards, we are not seeking perfection from day one. We understand as a standards development team and as the board, and indeed we can talk about this if she wants, that sustainability reporting for investors is a journey, and we understand that data may not be available in the short term for specific disclosure requirements. So this is considered in the relief provisions that IS1 and S2 include, as well as in the SASB standards. The report and explain principle that I talked about a couple of minutes ago does allow for companies to say, for this particular metric, we don't have the information right now, but we're working to collect information for future reporting. So that's allowed in the SASB standards. And again, back to the ISSB standards, with all the relief provisions, we are trying to help companies get that reliable information in time for their disclosure and implementation of S1 and S2.
All right, thank you very much, Arturo. I see Dr. Indidi's hands are raised.
Yeah, Can you hear us?
Yes,
We can
I
hear
can.
you, Ndidi.
Can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Okay, brilliant. We're still all in one happy family room. I'm not sure you heard the ambassador. So we've got several devices running in the same room, the Adoption Readiness Working Group, all participating actively in this exciting webinar. I'm not sure you heard the ambassador's response, did you?
No, we did not.
But Arturo, I think that you already began to respond, and I think the ambassador also was going to speak to, there was a question also about data, which is a big challenge, obviously, this part of the world, and how the metrics actually serve as an entry point to S1 and S2, which is the whole reason why FRCN has convened this particular workshop and is providing this guidance on how the industry-specific metrics, which are built into the climate-related standard S2, and which are a reference point for S1, which is a sustainability-related standard, will be used. And FRCN's commitment is to ensure that capacity building support is a priority so that you are able to provide and receive from this kind of webinar support, guidance, and insights into how to use the industry-based metrics, what S1 and S2 offer, how S1 and S2, which is extensively detailed in the illustrative guidance and also in the standards, basis for conclusions, and the reliefs that are have been adapted to ensure that even if you are smaller entities and even if you don't have access to data, one, the use of estimates is explained. Two, the use of quantitative measures as well as qualitative measures in order to disclose sustainability-related and climate-related risks is also talked about. And specifically, the SASB industry metrics give you a chance to pick up for your specific industry or a range of industries that are under a holding company, 6 on average topics and 13 on average specific metrics, which may or may not be material to your industry, and to start your disclosure from that journey. I think one of the things that that Ambassador always reminds me of, and I'm going to hand over the floor to him, is that we need to clarify this building block approach to make it quite clear that the whole point of S1 and S2 is to simplify things. Likewise, the industry-based disclosures are to provide a simplified entry point of tested and tried metrics that are likely to be material risks to your industry. So it's supposed to make it easier. And hopefully by the time we've done 1, 2, 3 workshops, which is what Ambassador keeps saying, we need capacity building, we need capacity building, we need more time, more investment, more learning. This will become so much more familiar. But Ambassador.
Yeah, thank you. So this is just a journey and we're just starting. It's going to entail a lot of more learning and learning and learning along the way. So as you said, those the S1, S2 are those baseline, okay? We're going to use them as building blocks. And luckily for us, the SASB standards are there for specific industries. And it's for us to go to those SASB standards, look at the metrics, select the ones that we think are applicable to us and use. If you're a holding company, it means probably you're operating in more than one specific sector. And it's for you to look at those particular sectors that you're involved with, and then look at the metrics, select the ones that are applicable for those particular sectors that apply to you, and then apply them. But as I said, it's just a journey. It's going to entail more and more learning, and it's just the beginning. We're going to continue to have this kind of capacity building programs, both with ISSB and with other entities, as well as in partnership with NGX and other regulators. So this is just the starting point.
All right, thank you very much, Ambassador. Thank you very much to all our speakers, facilitators, our attendees for taking out time to join us today for the first day in this workshop series. Please be reminded that this continues again tomorrow at 3 o'clock and it will run up until 5 p.m. And we're sure that we'll definitely be learning more knowledge about the SASB standard and everything that we need to know about this. My name is Anuluwako Jidonarwaju. Thank you very much once again for joining us. Do have a fantastic rest of the day. Bye-bye.